Before the war, I joined as a cadet at 16. When I turned 18, I joined the militia, and I was a corporal in the cadets, and then I was a corporal in the militia, and when the war broke out, I tried to enlist for the AOF, but they wouldn't allow me. My age was one problem. I had to grow a year older, and the other one was that they wouldn't let me. The army rounded up all of the best training NCOs and put them into a training corps so they could train the AOF recruits as quickly as possible. And so they formed a big camp up in North Queensland at Myawira, outside of Bowen, which was my hometown. And before that, it was a brigade militia camp for training for preventing invasion. So for being there, they kept me in that camp, and then they moved to Brisbane, the exhibition ground. Then I went to out to Grovelly. I was enforced into this training corps, and they wouldn't allow us to go overseas, and I had to kept on training. But anyhow, in 1942, they ran short of officers, so they wanted about 50 officers. So all of us NCOs in the training corps, we were sent to the officers' school, Liverpool, and I became a lieutenant in the AOF there. I joined the AOF then. So I said, oh, good, I can go overseas. I wanted to get overseas. And when I got back into my camp, the colonel called me and said, listen, we're putting you in charge of training. So I was in charge of training. Instead of being a training, I was in charge of training, being a lieutenant. So I had no chance. They wouldn't let me go overseas. And now the Japanese War broke out. When I was over in Cowan, that's a fortress outside of Brisbane. Like Sydney had these three fortresses, Middle Harbour, North and South. Well, Brisbane had Bribie Island, North Moreton Island, and the one on the land. And I was over in Moreton Island to put a defence around it because the Japanese War had started. And I got dengue, and I was in hospital, doped and so forth. And the matron said, I thought, would you want a cup of tea? And I said, yes, for sure, I would. And the tea didn't come around. I said, where's the tea? She said, I don't give you a tea. She said, yeah. I said, you asked you, did I want a cup of tea? She said, no, do you want to go overseas? And you said, yes. So that's how I got overseas. The Japanese War had started, so I went in the last reinforcements over so I got there in January and was a prisoner in February. I put my age up a year so I could go to officer school. I still had my pay books, but I didn't hand them across when I was being recruited into the AOF. Now, I had my mother was down because under 21 in those days you had to get your parents' consent. My mother came down and she signed the paper that I was 21 and I was 20. But anyhow, it's sort of I love the army. The army was my life. As you read, I had a lousy childhood life, and the army was my life. I loved it. It gave me everything I wanted, friends and there's respect and a systematic life. When I got there, they were up at Muir. That was a big battle between the 29th and the 19th. Half of them got wiped out. It was really bad. And all the recruits I brought over for the 26th, they went to the 29th. And so I was in base depot, and the first job I got was going into town rounding up soldiers who were coming back. They were getting cut off and overrun. They working their way in the drains back into Singapore. So I had trucks there and taken them back in the base depot to reissue them clothing and arms and so forth, and form them into units so they could go back and fight. So I didn't get into the battle until the last 10 days. And I had a company that had to go up to the mountain, no, not the hill, where they had the big reservoir. And our job was to defend the reservoir against the Japs taking it over. And but it didn't work. The Japs blew up the pipeline, and the water was coming from Malaysia. So the governor ordered the general to surrender, and we were real. Oh, I hated it. It was so bad having to surrender, and we considered that we could hold them off. But anyhow, that was a. We all marched got into camp in Changi, and we all sort of hated the idea of being prisoners of the Japs. But we didn't know what it was to be a prisoner until we went into these workforces. I was in Changi 6 months. A Force was the first one. It went up to Burma. We were in B Force, and we went to Borneo to build a big aerodrome for the Japanese Air Force up in Sandakan. And that's when we went over on the Ubi Maru, like we call it. That's potato ship. Ubi is potato ship. And it's the worst situation I've ever been in my life. This little ship with 1,700 troops crowded aboard in 3 layers. And they only went out on deck for about 20 minutes in the morning and 20 minutes in the afternoon when they could get a meal and pee and crap and so on. But people were getting dysentery, and crap and urine was leaking down on top of us. The smell was shocking, and the food was shocking. We were eating rice laced up with lime, yellow rice, and you couldn't imagine anything so bad as that. And when we got off at Sandakan, and half of them were taken ashore, went and slept at the cathedral, Church of England Cathedral. Now all their names are in a diary, and that diary is still at the cathedral. Anyone who goes to Sandakan, go up the Church of England Cathedral, they get the diary and they find all those who were camped that night. I was stayed on the ship, and we come out next morning, and we marched out to the Changi camp, to our Sandakan camp. It's packed. But after coming off the ship, it was like heaven. And so, but that's our first taste of prison camp. In Changi, it was a mess. We were just crowded into a whole division. It was crowded into one battalion's camp at Changi, and it was just a mess. We had to encircle ourselves. We put the barbed wire fences around ourselves and so forth. I was the first officer to get a bashing. We used to have little trucks. We used to pull the trucks out to the Changi Straits and get salt water to bring back to cook the rice in because there was no salt. And my party, I was in charge of it, was late. And now there's an Indian officer there, he sent the troops to bring me over. And that's the time when the Indian Army was breaking away from the British and joining the Japs. And they become camp guards and so forth. And they hated British officers. And so this Japanese officer, he called me over and smacked me across the face about 6 times and told me to stand there till he let me go. But that was the first person to get a bashing. It's just surprising. Just because it wasn't a Japanese bashing, it was an Indian. But anyhow, we realised things were going to get worse because the Japanese were pulling parties in to take into town to clear up the wharf and clear up the streets and knock down burnt buildings, and so they were taking prisoners into town to work, and they were camping on the wharves, and they were stealing food, so they liked it. But then they decided they were going to use us as slaves, and we were. A Force was the first one. They went up to Burma. And we were the second one in July 42 was B Force. We went to Borneo to build a big aerodrome for the Japanese Air Force. But it was then when our war started. The 10-day war I had, there was nothing. We were shooting and bombing each other. But the person-to-person war started when we became prisoners. And the Japanese, like in Borneo, in other camps, the officers didn't work. But in Borneo, every officer had to work. Or not every officer, but 90% of them. Because if you didn't work, there was no rations. Only you got rations based on the number of people working. So we volunteered to do it, so we get more rations in the camp. And so we would work the same as the men. We got bashed the same as the men. They get whipped with canes and so forth. And a lot of bashing went on the airport, like bad bashings. See, when you're getting bashed by the Japs, a bashing would last about 15 minutes. You get bashed and kicked and hit and whipped. Not every day, but reasonably often. In about 8 months, I had about 10 bashings, and my neck broken. But in Kuching, the bashings wasn't the same as on the aerodrome when we were working. There were some smacks across the face for being rude to Japanese officers and so forth, but they took the slightest opportunity to bring us into line and not let us act as if we were important people and they were not. We were knocking down a hill with picks and shovels and things to fill in a swamp. The only level of ground is a hilly country with this big swamp. So we had to fill the swamp in and make a flat ground airport. Anyhow, I was working on it, and I was talking to my friend next to me, and a Japanese guard come up and yelled at me, told me, no talk or work. And he got a pick handle or chunkle handle, and had a swipe hit me in the back. And I was a boxer, so I saw it coming. I went with it and took half the pressure off, but it still broke my neck. My neck twisted like this. Had I not moved, I would have been killed on the spot. But anyhow, I got carried back to camp, and a chiropractor and a specialist, they worked on my neck and got it back and tore my shirt up, soaked it in rubber, wrapped it around my neck. I was in hospital for about 4 months over that. And I've been on physio for the last 50 years, 3 days a week. I just got to have it, otherwise my nerves swell up and get hard, so they got to break down my nerve centers. Otherwise, I have the neck in my. Like today, I twisted my neck too far. Luckily, one of the nurses, she went and worked on it and got it fixed up. But it's a lifelong thing. The death rate of Borneo was 95.5%, and less than 5% came back. Every camp was wiped out except the one I was in. I was in the Borneo, Kuching, and that was the headquarters of the Japanese army. And we were down there. We were sent down there as a punishment because the underground movement started in our camp. Eventually became a revolution, and the civilians uprose against the Japanese and killed about 2,000 of them, and about 6,000 civilians were killed. Women and kids were raped and so forth. It was shocking, but it started up in Sandakan, and the underground used to bring in radio parts, and they built 2 radios in our camp, and we used to get the news, and we could the top bloke could broadcast out messages which was received in the Philippines and so forth. But and the supplies were brought in from the Sandakan Hospital, from the Australian doctor who was in charge of the Sandakan Hospital. He sent essential medicines in so the doctors could use it in operations and so forth. But a Japanese, an Indian and a Chinese who were in the underground had a fight. And the Indian went and reported to the Japanese about the underground. That's how they found out. And the Japs tortured them beyond belief. They got tortured. Everything you could think of in torture they did. And so they got the names of every person in the underground, including about 15 from our camp. The head man of our camp, he was executed over this. And the 2IC was about to be executed, but they lost the paperwork. And so his life was saved. And in the war trials, they sent him over to Outram Road. Outram Road was a Japanese secret police camp in Singapore. It was a brutal camp, but that's where the worst offenders of any prison camp were sent there. About a half of them died before their sentence was over, but it was a brutal. And but anyhow, the Japanese decided that soldiers got no brains, only the officers got brains, and therefore it was the officers who started this revolution, and therefore they were to be punished. So nearly all the officers were rushed back from work to go into their cabin or cubicle, get stuff, and they were shipped off to the Kuching, which is the headquarters and the big jail down there. And that actually, it was tougher there, but it saved our lives. And we're the only camp that wasn't wiped out. The orders were given to wipe out the camp, but and the graves were dug, but the war finished before they could be carried out. And the Japanese colonel in charge of the prison camp wouldn't carry it out because he served with the Allied in the First World War. Colonel Suga, I mentioned in my book. But it's sort of, you talk of these things generally, but it's very hard to go into detail because at the time we think no one would believe us anyhow. But to witness the torture is shocking. You feel it yourself, your nerves, and the screaming lasts. The next night you hear it. But overall, Borneo, as I said, was a shocking, the biggest death of any prison camp of all, more in line with the Jewish ones in the German war. On the death marches, I can't talk about it because I wasn't on it, but like you hear about it from I had 2 friends who were on the death march. Sergeant Major Stipwich, and he said that, when a soldier fell back, he was shot. If you couldn't keep on going, they had a Jap firing squad going behind the marchers, shooting them or bandaging them or whatever it was, and chuck them on the roadside. And that's why when the war graves, people come in, all they could find was a bundle of bones here and there, which animals and birds and reptiles tore apart. But they were DNA, they managed to get most of them together. But, and this broke the hearts of so many prisoners to see their mate, you know. And if a mate, and people were very sick. Not only were they starving, they were sick from malaria, beriberi, and all the other sort of scabies and so forth. And some stages they couldn't continue. So they fall by the wayside and knew they were going to get killed. So they give all their possessions away to their mates, strip their clothes off and lay there naked and give everything they had to their mates. One of the things about the Australian Army is so strong in mateship, more so than any other army. Well, the mateship which is a battalion, well, there was no mateship stronger than one prisoner with the other. They were just totally a brotherhood. They suffered so much and you knew everything about everybody. Everything you told, everything you knew, you told your mates and they told you. It was sort of a family. We knew more about them than their brothers and wives and mothers. And that was a very strong mateship. And that made it very hard to see them die or get killed. This sort of mateship clung on post-war. Every group had their reunions. There were battalions were strong, but battalions were broken up, and each battalion gave 100 men or 50 men to a B force, C force, E force, F force, and they become another unit, and they become even closer than they were in their own battalions. And many of these POWs, they have their reunions, and in the Sandakan in Borneo, it was the worst atrocity in Australian war history. It was kept secret. No one was allowed to talk about it or write about it because they didn't want, MacArthur didn't want more hatred against the Japs than there existed. And to show the Japs as cannibals and murderers they were, it would have upset the system. So, and not only that, it would have affected the relatives of the people who didn't come back. It was very bad because we used to help to guide our men. We slept in different quarters, but we'd have conferences and we'd guide them and give them advice, tell them not to escape because you got no hope of escape. There's nowhere to go. There's no means of transport. It wasn't until during the death march when they were able to meet with the local headhunters who got them to the, not many, only 6 of them, and got them away from the Japs to the Allies who were in there. But quite a lot of people attempted to escape, but they were killed. They bayoneted to death or shot to death. I had to go up and identify a couple and before they were buried and who they were and so forth. But we used to have to give this guidance and help them if we could. But it was difficult to leave because you're leaving your kids behind virtually. As an officer, your unit was, your platoon was your kids. You looked after their health, you looked after them. And when you had to walk away from them, it was just like a divorce or leaving them. They felt the same way in many cases, but in other cases they didn't. There wasn't 100% connection, but there was a big connection. In prison camp at Kuching, at Sandakan, we used to have a concert now and again. We have a choir and singers and people play things. but it was very rare. And the Japanese officers, they'd come down and watch the thing. But in Kuching, we built a stage on our parade ground and put all the things around. And every 3 months we could hold a concert. Sometimes it would be a play. Other times it would be in a sort of a radio show behind a screen. Other times it would be like sketches. Like I put a couple of sketches on as a hypnotist. In my young days, they used to have hypnotists come round into town and put a show on and hypnotise people to do all sorts of strange things and so forth. But so I put this show on, but I won the Academy Award for the best radio show. I had the Scarlet Pimpernel, but it was. At school I used to write plays as concerts, and I had about 4 sketch shows and 1 play, and that was just it was a wreck. The first time at a huge scaby camp, it came in our camp, and they had to separate them. They had to live in one hut, we had to live in the other. So half my team got scabies, so we had to cancel that show. The next show, we retrained a new team, and just that night it came down a bucketed rain, so that had to be cancelled. So the third time it's come on, I managed to get it finished, but it had a bad effect on me at the free time before. People talking about it, and the word got out of what it was about, and so forth and so forth. But anyhow, they were good shows. Like you had to go up to the Japanese headquarters. They had to read through. My show was called Love on the Double Cross. The Double Cross was this station like in America, a dude camp where people and the double cross. The Japanese saw it as a nasty word, double word. So they had to come up and had to explain what was the word, what I meant by double cross. Was I going to tell lies to the Japanese? Was I going to double cross them and so forth? But they read the play and they agreed with it. There was no bad feelings in it. We had radios in camps. We let the Japs find the one they found, which was didn't work, and the Japanese smashed it up. So they thought they had it. But when we went into Kuching, the British Signal Corps, they built a radio, and we used to get the news once a week. We'd get the war news. So we knew what was happening. We knew how the war was going. We knew it when it ended more earlier than the Japs knew. So we were sort of knew what was going on, and so we were prepared for all sorts of things. If the Japanese decided to attack us, we were going to rush and shoot through, and we weren't going to stand there and get shot. If they come out, we'd attack them. Even if we all got killed, we'd at least kill some of those. The Japanese colonel called us up for a parade. We had to get dressed up in our best clothes and so forth. Got a photo of it there. And he told us that the American had atomic bombs and dropped them on Japan, and his family was killed. He thought they were, but they weren't. They weren't home. They were in Nagasaki. And he said, the war is over. He said, but it isn't over for you yet, because the general won't surrender. And so the British, the Australian Army sent people down to talk him, and he still wouldn't. So the Emperor of Japan sent a royal member down to order him to surrender. So we were prisoners for a month after the war finished. We knew what was going on. The Air Force came over and dropped us food and clothing and medicine, so we thought we were picking up and really fit when the Australians come in to rescue us. But they couldn't believe, as fellow soldiers, how we looked so dead. And had quite a few breaking down and crying just seeing their fellow soldiers as we were. We thought we looked good. A month of food. We did look good to what we were before. But we were all prepared to go, and ABC come in and we sent radio messages home to our thing. I got photos of that in my book. And so we were sent out on American torpedo boats. They come in up the river to Kuching and took us out to Wanganella. We got on the Wanganella and it called into the island. I forget the name of the island. And then we got taken up to Morotai where the 2 army hospitals were. And we got there, but we started playing up too much. Like we were going to the canteens and we had pay books, and we drew pay out, and we were going up with the canteens and knocking off beer and chocolates, and breaking all the rules they said us. We must have a perfect diet, and anyhow, 2 of the blokes went to Manila. They got a lift over by American Air Force. They went over there and come back. So they said, "Oh Christ, we can't handle these people." So they put us back in the Wanganella, and we went down to Balikpapan and Banjarmasin to get the wounded soldiers there from the war and bring them up to the hospital. So that took us another 10 days before we took off. So after the war, after we got out, a month after the war finished, we didn't get home for another month. With the hospitalisation and the return to Borneo and the trip back to Australia, we pulled into a couple of islands, but we got back at end of October, and it was just marvellous. That was the best part of the war, was getting back to Australia.